The United States of America is the world's largest economy with the world's largest navy. I have explored American history briefly in the previous part. In this part, however, I will be focusing on the modern United States. The USA really came to be the world's central power in the past century, and its power mostly stands upon command of the seas. Before the World Wars, Europe has been dominating the global system. However, between the years 1914 and 1945, more than 100 billion people died. Since the World Wars largely took place in Europe, they devastated it, which led to fall of the European empires. The US interests in Europe were largely summed up by Captain of the American fleet Alfred Thayer Mahan, who thought that if the United States were to protect themselves against the Europeans, they had to play them off against each other, so that they would focus their forces on each other rather than the United States. If a single powerful European country was to emerge, it would have threatened the US security. That was the reason why the United States intervened in both world wars. In the aftermath of the Second World War, the United States emerged as the power dominating the international waters, as it had the largest and by far the most advanced navy on Earth. This fact was cemented with the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944, which largely established the rules for the international commerce. One part of the agreement, which is often overlooked, however, is that the American Navy guarantees security of the international shipping. It means that the United States can inspect and sink any ship. This happened because the Europeans were unable to sustain a fleet large enough, and in order to restore their economies, they needed an access to the American markets, since there was no other alternative. The Cold War was a struggle between the two global powers, the Soviet Union on the one hand and the United States on the other. The USSR was holding the most advantageous position in the whole Eurasian landmass. Which brings us to the Halford John Mackinder and his Heartland Theory. According to it, the land of the Russian Empire was a heartland of Eurasia, as it allowed Russians to easily move through the steppes of it and thus expand. The theory deserves a video of its own. However, briefly, the Russians had one major problem. The heartland does not possess any navigable rivers, which prevented its industrialization. Nevertheless, if the Russians were able to overcome this problem and take over the Eurasia, they would have the resources necessary to command the seas, and commanding the seas is the number one objective for the United States. Thus, the Cold War happened. By pressuring the USSR from the seas, the USA forced them to focus their military spendings on the land, thus preventing them from challenging the United States on the seas. Since the Soviet Union wasn't able to challenge the US on the seas, it had to focus on the land, which at the end led to the explosion of the Soviet system. Other than pressuring the Soviet Union, the USA had a secondary interest, which is preventing the formation of the regional hegemons. In international relations, a regional hegemon is a hegemony of one independently powerful state over its neighbors. Since such state won't be threatened on the land, it could use its resources to create a strong navy. A strong navy would threaten the US naval dominance. Thus, one of the US main strategic objectives is preventing such powers from occurring in the first place. We saw this in Yugoslavia in the 1990s and during the Gulf campaign. In both these cases, the US aimed at preventing one power from establishing a hegemony and then building a strong navy. However, invading every country on the Earth is not a solution, as it would be way too expensive. So the United States used an old strategy of playing off various powers against each other. For example, the Iraq-Iran war, during which, by supporting both sides, the United States aimed at extending the conflict as much as possible, and thus forcing both Baghdad and Tehran to focus their military spendings on the land instead of the seas. Whereas in the India-Pakistan conflict, both are forced to focus on the land and thus cannot challenge the United States in the Indian Ocean. To conclude, American power has been standing upon the command of the oceans, and its entire foreign policy strategy was centered around this. In order to control the seas, the USA had to prevent other powers from creating a large navy. This power allows the United States to allow or restrain trade to the allies or rivals of the day. Therefore, the United States has to carefully manage its relations and military engagements abroad in order to sustain its control of the oceans.